Let's call okay, good to know. Let's call the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Birnbaum, and scoring judges, please make sure that you have both your audio and your video off. It looks like you do. And those should just remain off until the trial ends. And so the only people on the screen should be the advocates and me, which it looks like we're all set. So can the attorneys please make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Bree Goodchild, and today I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Keem Nolan.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And we represent the government in today's proceedings.
And defense?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Sasha Yusuf, and today I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Joseph Kalarian.
Great.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Today we represent the defense of Ms. Kara Bassett.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna transition into opening statements. So can everyone who's scoring please make sure they're in speaker view. And whenever anyone else is talking, attorneys, please make sure you're muted. So defense counsel, I'd ask you to make sure that you mute yourself before Ms. Goodchild starts speaking.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, before proceeding to opening statements, we actually have a few housekeeping matters we'd like to address.
Okay.
First, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, which calls for the constructive sequestration for all witnesses.
Do you have any objection, counsel?
No objections, Your Honor.
Okay.
We would also like to bring to the court's attention number 7 on the pretrial order in this case.
And what about it?
Yes, Your Honor, this document says that exhibits 4 through 33 have already been entered into evidence for today's proceedings, and thus waives any kind of foundational objections for us to lay that foundation in court during today's trial.
Okay.
And then lastly, we would also like to draw attention to pretrial order number 6, which gives us the permission to display exhibits once they're entered into evidence on the screen at any point in today's trial without first asking permission. But we would like to ask for your preference when we're laying foundation with witnesses to enter evidence into the record. Are we allowed to show that on shared screen before it's shown to the jury? Or do you like us to show that without putting it on the screen for the court to see?
You can just go ahead and put it on the screen for the purposes of this.
All right. And with that, we're ready to proceed with opening statements, Your Honor.
Okay. And Mr. Yusuf, did you have anything housekeeping-wise you wanted to add?
Nothing, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed.
Okay. So Ms. Goodchild, whenever you're ready.
Members of the jury. Kara Bassett is alone in a Florida swamp. The sky is dark, the air is hot and sticky, and the bugs and critters are so loud she can barely hear herself think. But she waits. She wants to watch with her own 2 eyes as her husband's body sinks deep into the muddy water. To know for sure that his body will never be found. She knows he's already dead. Just hours before, she pumped enough poison into him to kill an elephant. Certainly enough to kill a normal man. So she watches as Don Clark's body sinks into the swamp, never to be recovered. And then she goes home to get everything that she wanted. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear today that this death didn't happen out of the blue. That Don Clark didn't disappear without cause. You're going to hear that this kill was calculated. But how did we get to this point? Today, you're going to get to learn about an interesting and unusual couple. About Don Clark and his wife, the defendant. After the pair got married back in 2011, they opened up an elephant park. Now you're going to hear today that while both of the couples were dedicated to this mission, they had drastically different ideas on how to run the elephant park. You see, Mr. Clark, he ran it like a business. The elephants were an investment. But to his wife, she could not stand the way he treated these creatures. For her, it wasn't a job, it was a passion project. And after spending years arguing and begging with her husband to change the way he treated the elephants at the elephant park, she had enough. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to get to hear today that the defendant crafted a plan. That back in May of 2017, she specifically requested on the power of attorney for her husband that if he was ever to disappear, she would get everything. Now, I'm not just talking about the bank accounts and the house, but what she really wanted: control of the elephants. And after she had that power of attorney, there was only one thing that stood in her way: her husband. You're going to hear that on August 18th of 2017, the defendant finally put her plan into action. You're going to get a chance today to meet Special Agent Johnson, the lead FBI investigator in the disappearance of Don Clark. And she's going to walk you through the steps that she took to figure out who killed Mr. Clark, and how she found 2 pieces of physical evidence that connected directly back to the defendant. You're going to hear about a missing elephant tranquilizer, a piece of access that only the defendant had access to that could easily have killed Mr. Clark. You're going to hear about forensic evidence that connects where they suspected the body was dropped back to the defendant's clothes. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear today that the only reasonable explanation for why Mr. Clark is no longer with us is because of the defendant's actions. Now, as the state, it's not enough for us to just say that. Today, we're going to prove it to you. We're going to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Kara Bassett killed her husband intentionally. Now, that means by the end of today's trial, you'll have to see that the only reasonable explanation for why Mr. Clark is gone is because of the defendant. And we're confident that we'll meet that today. So throughout today's trial, I want you to look in for a couple of details. I want you to look to see who would have access to the elephant tranquilizer. I want you to listen in for who was connected to the swamp the night of August 18th. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to ask yourselves, who stood to gain if Mr. Clark disappeared? At the end of today's trial, it will become clear that the only logical explanation was the defendant. You'll see that the kill was calculated. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Mr. Yusuf, whenever you're ready.
Opening statement from the defense. May I proceed?
Yes.
Members of the jury, this case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. It's August 26, 2018. Detective Stephen Johnson arrives to Miss Bassett's home per her request. He's here to find her husband. Now, Miss Johnson, she interviews dozens of people. And he starts with Don Clark's children. He asks them, do you know what happened to Mr. Clark on August 18th? They respond, no. She then goes to the employees of the elephant park and asks them, do you know what happened to Mr. Clark on August 18th? They don't know either. One by one, Agent Johnson asks law enforcement officials, park rangers, the victim's lawyers, airport employees, and even Miss Bassett, and they all respond with the same answer. No, I don't know. Because the reality is, members of the jury, is that this case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. Now, as the defense, we don't bear the burden of proof in today's case. That burden lies solely on the prosecution, and they have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Kara Bassett killed her husband deliberately and intentionally. Now, what this means is that it's not enough for them to say she might have done this. It's not enough for them to say that she probably did this. They have to prove to you that that is the only reasonable explanation for the events that happened that day. Beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the highest burden in our entire judicial system. And that's a burden that starts on the prosecution's end and not once moves to the defense. And they're not going to be able to meet that burden for two different reasons. Because this case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. Now, what are those two things? Well, first, there's missing evidence in today's case. And second, there was an incomplete investigation and someone else could have done this crime. So let's start with the missing evidence. The members of the jury, the first person you're going to hear from in today's trial is going to be Special Agent Johnson. The government's going to call her up to the stand today, and I want you to listen to her words. Because when she gets up on that stand, she's not going to be able to tell you that a body was recovered. When she gets up on that stand, she's not going to be able to tell you that a murder weapon was discovered. When she gets upon that stand, she's not going to be able to tell you that there was a confession. And when she gets upon that stand, she's not going to be able to tell you that a single eyewitness saw what happened to Dawn Clark. Members of the jury, that brings me to my second point. It's not only that you're going to learn that they didn't have a body, a murder weapon, an eyewitness, or a confession, but members of the jury, you're going to learn that they failed to explore an alternative suspect. That's going to be Dawn Clark's ex-wife. You're going to hear her name, Lisa Clark, a couple of times throughout trial, and I want you to remember her name. I want you to remember Lisa Clark when I come up here on cross-examination and ask Agent Johnson whether she had an alibi. I want you to remember Lisa Clark's name when I come here and ask Agent Johnson whether she was able to interview her. I want you to remember Lisa Clark's name when Agent Johnson tells you that Lisa Clark was glad that Dawn Clark was dead. But we're not only going to tell you that through their witness, members of the jury, we're going to call our own, Mr. Joe Kwong. He's actually going to tell you that before Dawn Clark went missing, his ex-wife came to the Elephant Park and said, "I'll wipe you from this earth." And that the same person that said, "I'll wipe you from this earth," Agent Johnson didn't investigate. Members of the jury, that's because this case comes down to one moment that the government can only guess about. Now, members of the jury, we're not here to tell you that Ms. Bassett is a perfect human. We're not here to tell you that she was a perfect wife, but there's a difference between being an imperfect wife and being a murderer. All we ask is that each and every time the government comes up here, that you don't take them at their word, but you hold them to their verdict. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf. So before we proceed to the government's first witness, I'm just going to remind everyone to switch their view to gallery view now, so that we can all see everything that's going on. And Ms. Goodchild, whenever you'd like to call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The government calls Agent Steph Johnson.
Ms. Johnson.
Good afternoon. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Special Agent Steph Johnson, FBI.
Can you tell us a bit about what you do for a living?
Well, I'm a special agent with the Bureau. I work in the Criminal Investigations Unit, and I've been a part of the Jacksonville branch since 2015.
Can you tell us about the training you've received to work in this position?
Well, I started off my career with the NYPD for the first 10 years. In 2002, I began training at Quantico. A year later, I was made a special agent with the Bureau. And after that, I was promoted to a senior position in 2015. That's when I moved out to the Jacksonville office and started specializing in criminal investigations.
Agent Johnson, I'd like to direct your attention to the missing persons case of Don Clark. Can you explain your involvement in this case?
On August 25th at 10:00 hours, I received a call from the Tallahassee police who reported to me that an individual had identified her husband as a missing individual. That was a Miss Kara Bassett, and she reported that Don Clark, a 38-year-old male, had disappeared from her residence.
Did you take on any responsibilities for this case?
Yes, I was the lead investigator on the case.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, I want to walk through what you did on that investigation, starting when you received that call. Can you tell us what time you got that information? Agent Johnson, can you hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us when you first became involved in the case, please?
Like I said, I received a call on the morning of August 25th at 10:00 hours from the Tallahassee police informing me that a Miss Kara Bassett had reported her husband as missing.
At that time, did you know when Mr. Clark had gone missing?
According to the phone call to the Tallahassee police, Miss Bassett reported her husband as having left on August the 18th.
Now, once you have this information, how did you proceed with the investigation?
Well, at the point that the investigation was transferred to the Bureau, I met the defendant at her residence. That was the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
What happened there?
Once I arrived at the scene, my team and I conducted a search of the 5 square mile property. We canvassed the area, looked into all enclosures, buildings, storage facilities, and all registered vehicles on the property.
Agent, during your search, did you find any indication for where Mr. Clark might have gone on the night of the 18th?
Well, the defendant reported to us that she saw her husband at 9 p.m. on the night of his disappearance, and at the time that we arrived at her residence, she directed us to a vehicle that was registered in his name at the Carrie Bell Leone International Airport.
Once you found this vehicle, what was the next step in your investigation?
Objection, Your Honor. Mischaracterizing the evidence, if I may be heard.
Sure.
Your Honor, now on the demonstrative that opposing counsel just put up on the screen, it says that on August 23rd, there was a van located at the airport. However, Your Honor, we just heard from this witness that she actually didn't get involved in the investigation until August 25th. That's 2 days after August 23rd. Therefore, Your Honor, by putting that there was a van located at the airport on August 23rd, it's mischaracterizing the information that we have on the record and therefore should be excluded under Rule 403, Your Honor.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
The question I asked to Agent Johnson was during her search if she found any indication for where he might have gone on the night of August 18th. What Agent Johnson said was that she was told by the defendant that she found the victim's car at the airport on August 23rd. It doesn't matter that she became involved in the case later on after this. We're going through the details of how she figured out what happened to Don Clark. There's no mischaracterization, and it's certainly not substantially more prejudicial than it would be probative.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think the wording on your timeline is misleading. So if you'd like to keep the timeline, I ask that you change the wording to clarify who located the van. Because right now it seems like it was your witness that did that.
Motion to
Okay.
strike that portion off the record, Your Honor.
Yes, granted.
Your Honor, at this point, we would just ask to constructively redact that portion due to technological issues with making those adjustments mid-trial.
Okay, so what would you like it to say instead?
We'll just remove the August 23rd portion.
Okay, is that all right with you, Mr. Yusuf?
Yes, Your Honor, as long as the date is removed, that is perfectly fine with us, Your Honor.
Okay. It's constructively removed.
Agent Johnson, let's talk through what you figured out happened on August 18th. Did you find any indication for where Mr. Clark went that evening?
Yes. Upon finding the individual's van, we were able to obtain GPS records of where that van had been on the night of his disappearance.
Let's walk through what those records show. What was the first place you saw that Mr. Clark's van had been?
Well, we were able to track that the first place that the van had been located that night was at the residence of Mr. Clark at around 11:14.
Did you see any other messages from Mr. Clark at that time?
We were able to match up that exact time with an outgoing communication from a cellular device registered in Mr. Clark's name, informing going out for a while.
Where did the car go after 11:14?
The GPS records indicated to us that at 11:17, the car left the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park and began driving 139 miles westbound to the Big Gum Swamp.
What time did they arrive at the swamp?
The vehicle registered to Mr. Clark arrived at the swamp at around a little after 1 a.m.
Detective, were you able to see how long the vehicle was at the swamp?
Yes. According to the GPS records, the vehicle remained stationary at the Big Gum Swamp for approximately 40 minutes.
Would 2:10 a.m. sound about right from your records?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you able to see where the car went after 2:10 a.m.?
At that point, the vehicle began moving eastbound for another 2 hours and eventually was parked at the Carrie Bell Leone International Airport at around 4:29 a.m.
Well, how did this
We're
impact
going to re-raise a 403 objection as to the phrasing where it says Don Clark's van was abandoned at the airport. Your Honor, we don't believe that the fact that this van was abandoned was elicited through any of the testimony we've heard thus far.
Do you have a response, Ms. Goodchild?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness has already testified that they found the van at the airport without anybody there, that it was reported being there completely alone. There's not an unfair prejudice with the word abandoned for a car being empty in the airport. This simply doesn't fall under the bar for 403.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Your Honor, the word abandonment infers that someone intended to leave it there and then never returned to the vehicle. Your Honor, we don't believe that that information has been established throughout this direct examination, and therefore by opposing counsel using that word abandoned, they're mischaracterizing the evidence we have on record, and we move to exclude it under Rule 403.
Yeah, Ms. Goodchild, I'm going to agree with Mr. Yusuf and sustain his objection. I do think the word abandoned does imply something. So is there a different word you would like to constructively put in there instead of abandoned?
We'll say arrived, Your Honor, if that's amenable.
That's fine.
That's fine with us, Your Honor.
Okay, Ms. Goodchild, you can continue.
All right. Well, Agent Johnson, I want to take a step back and talk a bit more about that swamp. Did you ever find any evidence during your search to connect the defendant to Big Gum Swamp?
Well, yes. After locating the vehicle, my forensics team began DNA and forensic testing on the vehicle. At that point, we were able to find 6 hairs that matched Mr. Clark, as well as material that traced back to an item of clothing that the defendant identified as her own.
What was this material?
In particular, it was a specific type of algae that was found at the Big Gum Swamp. We found that same type of algae on the defendant's shoes.
During the course of your investigation, did you find this algae anywhere else?
Yes, we did. We found the same type of algae on the gas pedal of the vehicle registered in Mr. Clark's name.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, I want to turn your attention to what could have caused this incident. During your search of the elephant sanctuary, did you find anything that could have been used as a weapon?
Yes, we did find a storage facility full of chemical compounds called carfentanil. Upon asking the defendant about this compound, she identified it as an elephant tranquilizer. And after we asked her for her records, she revealed that one bottle of that compound was missing from the storage facility.
Could the defendant tell you why a vial of this sedative was missing?
Well, we interviewed the defendant multiple times, and she told us that she knew the syringe was missing, but she didn't know exactly where it had gone.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, I want to turn your attention to Elisa Clark. Is that a name you're familiar with, ma'am?
Yes, it is.
Well, can you tell us who this is?
Yes, that would be the ex-wife of the missing individual, Don Clark. She was also located in the Florida area.
Was Lisa Clark ever a suspect in your investigation?
No, ma'am. We investigated Miss Clark. However, she did refuse our request for an interview.
Did you ever find any evidence that Miss Clark was at Big Gum Swamp in late August?
Like I said, Miss Clark refused to speak with us.
Did you ever get any eyewitness testimony or tips that she was at the swamp that evening?
We did not speak to Miss Clark about what she had done that evening. No.
I'm sorry, Agent Johnson, let me clarify. Did anyone else that you interviewed in your investigation indicate that Miss Clark might have been there on August 18th?
No, they did not.
Thank you, Agent, for your time. I have nothing further.
Okay, Mr. Yusuf, do you have a cross-exam?
Yes, Your Honor, we do.
Whenever you're ready.
Good morning, Detective Johnson. How are you today?
Good afternoon, sir.
Now, I want to talk about your investigation, Agent Johnson. You would agree with me that it's important to be thorough, right?
Of course.
To gather all possible evidence, right?
Yes, and I always do in my investigations. It's very important.
To speak to all witnesses, right?
Of course.
To follow every single lead that could lead to a conclusion, right?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk about someone named Lisa Clark. You spoke on direct examination about her. You know who she is, right?
Yes. Lisa Clark is an individual that we were made aware of throughout the course of our investigation. We identified her as the ex-wife of the man who went missing.
And so the man who went missing was Don Clark, right?
Yes.
Agent Johnson, you actually know that his ex-wife has a $2 million lawsuit pending against him, right?
Yes, sir. We were made aware of that throughout the course of our investigation as well.
So you actually reached out to her to see if she would talk with you, right?
Yes, we did.
You were never able to conduct an interview with Lisa Clark, right?
No, we spoke briefly, but she did deny a request for a formal interview.
I actually want to talk about the time where you spoke briefly with Lisa Clark. You went to her residence, right, where you talked with her?
Yes, I was able to locate her there.
You actually told her that Don Clark had gone missing, right?
Yes, I asked Miss Clark for a formal interview regarding his disappearance.
Well, when you said that, Lisa Clark, the ex-wife of the person who was missing, said that blank deserved to die, right?
Yes, and when I heard that information, it was very concerning to me. So after that, I began looking into Miss Clark.
Agent Johnson, sitting in court today, you don't have an alibi for Lisa Clark, right?
No, I was not able to locate Miss Clark's whereabouts that night as she had denied an interview, but we were able to speak to other individuals as well as obtain some phone records for Miss Clark. And after conducting that search, we were able to rule her out as a formal suspect.
Agent Johnson, that wasn't my question. I'm just asking you, sitting in court today, Lisa Clark, she doesn't have an alibi, right?
She never spoke to me about her alibi, no.
Now, Agent Johnson, I want to talk about some things you didn't have in your investigation. You're aware of what an eyewitness is, right?
Of course, sir.
You know that an eyewitness, they're someone who actually sees a crime being committed, right?
Yes, sir.
You'd say they're important in an investigation, right?
Of course, I've interviewed plenty of eyewitnesses in my investigations.
And eyewitnesses are important because they're able to tell you what happened when a crime occurs, right?
Yes, it's certainly useful to have someone who was there.
Mr. Kalarian, could you put up demonstrative for me right now? Agent Johnson, so you actually spoke to a couple of different witnesses, right?
Yes, sir. I interviewed a number of people from the park as well as other areas that the van was located that night.
Let's talk about the people that you interviewed. You interviewed personnel at the elephant park, right?
Yes, I did.
You interviewed personnel on the swamp grounds, right?
Yes.
You even interviewed people from Costa Rica, isn't that right?
Yes, sir. We conducted a very thorough interview process.
Agent Johnson, now I'm looking for a number here. Could you tell me how many of those witnesses that you interviewed could tell you that they saw Dawn Clark die on August 18th, 2018?
Sir, we didn't have any witnesses who told us that they saw the murder occur. We believe the murder happened in the middle of the night.
So Agent Johnson, that's 0 people that you talked to that told you they saw Dawn Clark die on August 18th, right?
Yes, sir. There were no witnesses who were there for the murder.
Agent Johnson, there were 0 people that you talked to that said that they saw Kara Bassett murder Dawn Clark, right?
Like I said, there were no witnesses at the swamp that night.
Well, Agent Johnson, I want to talk about another thing that you didn't have. Now, on direct examination, you told us that you determined that a lethal weapon was a syringe of elephant tranquilizer, right?
Yes, we found a large inventory of this compound on the defendant's property.
You would agree with me that you know exactly what a murder weapon is, right?
Yes, sir.
It's the thing that people use to kill the person who died, right?
Yes, that's what a murder weapon is.
Agent Johnson, you would say that finding a murder weapon is important in a case, right?
Yes, it's always helpful to have the murder weapon. Unfortunately, especially in murder cases, it's pretty hard to find the weapon on most accounts.
Well, Agent Johnson, I'm not asking about how hard it is, but in today's case, you didn't find that murder weapon, right?
We were not able to locate the particular syringe that was used in the attack, as we believe it was disposed of, but we were able to find an exact match of an inventory of this compound at the defendant's residence.
All right, Agent Johnson, I want to talk about a third thing that you don't have. You know what an autopsy is, right?
Yes, sir.
You know that an autopsy is when your forensics team, they actually look at a body and they dissect it, right?
Sir, I'm very familiar with autopsies, yeah.
And they do that so that they could find what the cause of death was, right?
Yes, when you have a body, you perform an autopsy to confirm the cause of death.
Agent Johnson, in today's case, you didn't find a body, right?
No, we were not able to locate the body as we believe it was disposed of in a swamp.
Agent Johnson, you can't even confirm with us with 100% certainty that Dawn Clark is dead, right?
No, sir, we have an overwhelming amount of evidence that Mr. Clark was killed that night.
Agent Johnson, you're telling us you know that Dawn Clark is dead without a body?
Yes, sir. All of our evidence led us to that conclusion.
Agent Johnson, you're telling us you know Dawn Clark is dead without a murder weapon?
Yes, sir. That's what the evidence pointed to.
Agent Johnson, you're telling us you know Dawn Clark is dead when not a single one of your witnesses saw him die?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Okay, Ms. Goodchild, do you have a redirect?
No, Your Honor. We ask that Agent Johnson be excused.
Okay, Ms. Johnson, you're excused. Does the government have any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor, the government rests its case in chief.
Okay. Mr. Yusuf, would you like to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor, we would. Today we call Mr. Joe Kwong to the stand.
Mr. Kwong?
May I proceed?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kwong. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Of course. Hi, I'm Joe Kwong.
What do you do for a living?
Well, that's a complicated question. I started off as an actor. I did low-budget movies, some commercials. But at a shoot one day, the director came up to me and he said, "Joe, you have a face for radio." So at that point, I knew it was time to go behind the camera, and I became a producer.
So what have you been doing recently?
Well, I actually just released my latest documentary. It was called The Last Dance of the Last Dance. It was a documentary about the documentary about Michael Jordan. You probably saw it on ESPN3 or ESPN The Ocho.
Now, Mr. Kwong, do you know who Kara Bassett is?
Of course. Kara hired me to film her in her elephant park back in 2015. She saw Tiger King and she wanted to be the next elephant queen.
And how would you describe Kara Bassett?
A bit odd, a bit obsessed with elephants, but other than that, she was kind, affectionate, loved her husband, Don. She was a very nice lady.
Do you know exactly what she did at her elephant park?
Well, essentially, she was the caretaker of the animals. She watched after them, she fed them. If they were ever sick, she helped take care of them. She was really just looking out for their best interest.
And then, do you know who Don Clark is?
Of course, that was Kara's husband.
Did you interact with Don Clark often when you were on the job?
All the time. Don was sort of the head honcho there at the elephant park. So I talked with him, I filmed him when I was making our documentary. We talked a bunch while I was there.
So, Mr. Kwong, you told us that you were filming Kara Bassett and Don Clark at the park. Could you tell me about how often you filmed there?
I mean, I started back in 2015, and I was probably there 40 to 50 weeks out of the year, 5 days a week. So I was there quite a bit.
And was the camera always on when you were at the elephant park?
Oh, always. That's our number one rule. We try to get everything when we're making our documentaries. We want to be as thorough as possible.
And so how much footage did you accumulate during those 3 years that you worked with them?
I mean, between the interviews, some of the B-roll, I think we had about 2,000 hours of film.
Did you have footage of Kara Bassett in those videos?
Of course. We had Miss Bassett helping the elephants. We had some one-on-one interviews. We also had her interacting with her husband in some of those videos.
And so you had footage of Don Clark too?
Oh, of course. Yeah, we had some one-on-one interviews with Don Clark. We had some videos of Don Clark running the sanctuary. We really got to see everything at the elephant park.
Do you have footage on the day that Don Clark actually went missing?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I was there that day till about 6 p.m. So I probably have footage from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. that day.
Now, I want to talk about what the FBI did with that footage. Did they ever ask you for any part of that 2,000 hours worth of footage?
No, never.
Well, Mr. Kwong, I want to talk about who else might have wanted Don Clark dead. Do you know if he had an ex-wife?
Yes, unfortunately, Mr. Clark did.
Did you ever see them interact at the elephant park together?
Yeah, so Don's ex-wife, Lisa, she was a bit eccentric too. She actually came to the elephant park one time and was sort of yelling at him and saying these things, threatening him.
Could you tell us about the threat that his ex-wife made to him at the elephant park?
I mean, her eyes got big and she looked at him and she said, "I will wipe you off the face of the earth." It was pretty spooky.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to talk about the day that Don Clark went missing. That was August 18th. You were working there, right?
That's right. I was there from about 9 a.m. in the morning to I think 6 p.m. in the afternoon.
I want to talk about what you don't know about that day. You said you left at around 6 p.m.?
That's right.
So, do you know where Don Clark went after 6 p.m. that day?
Not really, no.
Did you ever see Don Clark die that day?
No, no, when I left, him and Kara were talking. Everything seemed pretty normal to me.
Did you ever see Kara Bassett kill Don Clark?
Not at all. When I left, they were talking. I think they were joking around. It was just a normal day.
Mr. Kwon, you came back about a week later, right, to the Elephant Park?
That's right, for some more footage.
And was that when the FBI was investigating?
Yeah, they were looking around. They were gathering some evidence, talking to some people.
Did you talk to the staff that was around you?
Yeah, I spoke to a few people.
Did any of the staff at the park tell you that they saw Don Clark die?
No, I interviewed a few members of the staff, some of the regulars at the park, and no one said anything like that.
Did you hear anyone say that they saw Kara Baston kill Don Clark?
No, never.
Thank you, Mr. Kwong. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Okay, Ms. Goodchild, do you have a cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Kwon.
Good afternoon.
Now, I'd like to first start by talking a bit more about your interactions with Miss Bassett leading up to her husband's disappearance.
Sure.
Now, you'd agree with me that the defendant was a big fan of elephants.
Oh my God, she loved them. She had stuffed animals. I think the soap in the bathroom was even in the shape of an elephant. It was a bit weird.
The elephants at her park were a passion project for her.
Oh, of course. Yeah, she took care of them all the time.
They were something she cared about very deeply.
That's right.
And over the course of your documentary, she expressed some concerns she had about the way the elephant park was being run, right?
Yeah, that's right. Kara really cared about the animals, and her husband, Don, he really cared about the business. He was, counting the pennies, making sure they were making a profit.
She complained to you that the elephants were kept in cages.
Yeah, she did. I think she wanted them to be roaming free, more of like an animal sanctuary rather than, a zoo.
She complained about the way her husband treated elephants.
Yeah, she did voice some concerns about sort of the profit of the zoo and also putting them in cages, things like that.
Now, Mr. Kwon, I'd like to direct your attention to one of the times the defendant complained about her husband. Now, you'd remember a recording you took back in June of 2017?
Yeah, I took a bunch of recordings and interviews with Miss Bassett back then.
I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit 36. Now, this is one of those recordings, isn't it, sir?
1 second. Yeah, yes, it is.
You're obviously familiar with your footage.
Yes, I am.
Your Honor, the government offers Exhibit 36 into evidence.
Is there any objection?
There's no objection, Your Honor.
Okay, admitted.
Mr. Nolan, if you would play the footage.
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Now, Mr. Kwon, I'd like to direct your attention to how things changed after Don Clark went missing. You'd agree with me that in October of 2017, the defendant took over control of the elephant park.
Yeah, she became like the CEO of the park at that point.
She was finally the one who would call the shots.
That's right.
And there were some pretty drastic changes that happened at the elephant park that month.
Yeah, I mean, a few things changed. They became a nonprofit at that point. All the cages went away, and people really couldn't get as close to the elephants as they could before.
Well, even more than that, sir, the park actually changed to a sanctuary, right?
Yeah, like I said, it became like a nonprofit or an animal sanctuary.
An animal sanctuary for baby elephants.
That's right.
The defendant even told you that she got exactly what she wanted.
That's right. You know, Kara really loved the elephants. She wanted them to roam free. She didn't want people too close to them. She really loved them.
Let's talk about how far she was willing to go due to her love of elephants. Sir, you're familiar with Exhibit 38 in this case, right?
I believe so. Could I see it real quick?
Yes. Loading right now, sir.
Oh, great.
This is another clip you took back in June of 2017.
Yes, it looks like it.
Where the defendant described how far she would go for her elephants.
I believe so. I think so.
Your Honor, the government offers Exhibit 38.
Do you have any objections, Mr. Yusuf?
There's no objections, Your Honor.
Okay, admitted.
Mr. Nolan, if you would.
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Kwong. I have nothing further at this time.
Okay, is there any redirect?
There is no redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused.
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense rests its case in chief, and we're ready to proceed to closing argument.
Okay. Is the government ready for closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so Ms. Goodchild, whenever you're ready.
Real quickly, Your Honor, if we could just make sure everyone switches over to speaker view.
Yes, thank you. Let's just give everyone a second to do that.
Of course.
Okay, let's assume everyone's in speaker view. So Ms. Goodchild, you can proceed.
Members of the jury. On August 18th of 2017, the defendant waited. She waited until it was dark, waited until they were alone, until finally she could put her month-long plan into action. She injected her husband with deadly poison, dragged his body 130 miles away to Big Gum Swamp, and ditched his corpse, never to be seen again. And after all her hard work, she got to return home and get everything she ever wanted. She got to make the change at the elephant park that she had desired for years. Members of the jury, that's why the kill was calculated. The government has brought a charge of murder against Kara Bassett. And in doing so, that means we took on the burden of proof. Throughout today's trial, we had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant intentionally killed her husband. We had to prove that the only logical explanation for what happened to Mr. Clark was that the defendant knowingly took his life. And today we've met that burden. So let's go through today's trial to see how we've met our burden and to understand how this kill was so calculated. Let's start with how it happened. Today you got a chance to meet Agent Johnson, a lead FBI investigator who walked us through the events of August 18th. She told us how during the course of their investigation, they found that Mr. Clark's body was likely discarded in Big Gum Swamp. And we know how it got there. We heard today that during a forensic evidence, they found that a unique compound of algae, a very rare type found in Big Gum Swamp, was also found in the van as well as on the defendant's shoes. Ladies and gentlemen, that means there is a physical trail of evidence linking the defendant to the crime scene. And we know how she got her husband there. We heard from Agent Johnson that during her investigation, there was one syringe full of elephant tranquilizer left unaccounted. Something that the defendant had access to, would know how to use, and conveniently couldn't explain to the FBI when questioned about it. And ladies and gentlemen, you might be asking yourselves, why? Why would the defendant kill her husband? would she really go this far just because she liked elephants? Members of the jury, I want you to think about what we heard in trial today. Mr. Kwong said it best when he said the defendant was obsessed with elephants. This wasn't just her favorite animal, but a passion project, something she had dedicated her life several years to. Now, we heard that over the years she had spent fighting and arguing with her husband about the way he treated these animals, and then in 2017, she snapped. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't even need to ask ourselves how far we think the defendant would go for her elephants, because she told us. She told us that she was willing to take anyone to the grave if it would protect those elephants. And that's exactly what she did. On August 18th, when she sent her husband to a watery grave in the swamp, because when she returned home, because of the power of attorney she had, she received everything. She received the elephant park and was finally able to make the changes she had been demanding for years. She turned it into an animal sanctuary for baby elephants. She let them out of the cages. As she told Mr. Kwong, she finally had everything she ever wanted. Members of the jury, in a trial like this, it's easy to get lost in all of the evidence. So when you go back to deliberate, I want you to focus on the simple details. Because during their opening statements, the defense may have told you that there could have been an alternative suspect, but we know that's just not reasonable. Because the defendant was the only one who had access to that elephant tranquilizer, not Lisa Clark. The defendant was found with algae on her boots, directly connecting her back to the place Mr. Clark's body was abandoned. Not Lisa Clark. We know that the defendant had everything to gain with her husband's passing, that she had a motive, the access, and the means to commit this crime. The only reasonable explanation is that the defendant's kill was calculated. Members of the jury, when you go back to deliberate, I want you to remember what the defendant herself said about the animal sanctuary. That she would do anything. That she would take someone to the grave. And that's exactly what she did. Hold her accountable for her actions and find the defendant guilty of murder.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Mr. Yusuf, whenever you're ready.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Members of the jury, this case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. Now, I actually wrote it down. There were 118 questions asked throughout trial today. Some by the prosecution, some by the defense, but not a single one of those questions gave us an answer to know what happened that night. Not a single one of those answers could explain to us where Mr. Clark went. Not a single one of those answers from 118 questions even let us know that he's dead. Members of the jury, we're at the same exact point in the trial that we were an hour ago during opening statements. What we do know is that on August 18th, 2018, Mr. Clark disappeared and was never seen again. What we don't know is whether or not he's even alive, where he might be, or who, if anyone, would try to kill him. It comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. So members of the jury, before we start waving fingers at Kara Bassett, I want you to meet her. Today you learned that Ms. Bassett is incredibly passionate about elephants. You heard she actually created an animal sanctuary to protect orphaned and endangered elephants from being mistreated and killed. Ms. Bassett saves them from poachers, ivory traders. People who know her like to call her the Elephant Queen. And today the government wants you to think someone who cares so much about life would take one? Well, fortunately, members of the jury, it's not enough for them to tell you she's a murderer. They have to prove it to you today. That's because the government had a burden in today's case, like I explained to you in opening statements. These prosecutors have the highest burden in our entire judicial system. They had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Kara Bassett was the person that committed this crime. And if there's even one other reasonable explanation to what happened that night, you must find her not guilty. And members of the jury, we showed you why the government failed to meet their burden two ways. First, we showed you that they're missing crucial pieces of evidence. And two, we showed you that they failed to investigate someone else who wanted to kill Dawn Clark. Members of the jury, let's start with what they missed. We actually talked to Agent Johnson on the stand. She told us how important eyewitness testimony was. She told us how important a murder weapon was. She told us just how important it was to recover a body. Members of the jury, I asked Agent Johnson, did you have any eyewitnesses that actually saw what happened? She didn't find it. I asked Agent Johnson, did you actually find the murder weapon that you think killed Dawn Clark? She said she doesn't have it. I asked Agent Johnson, do you have the body so we can know whether or not he's actually dead? Members of the jury, Agent Johnson said she didn't find it. Members of the jury, we're sitting today in a homicide case. We're sitting today because the government said that this person was killed. How could we know that if not a single person came up here and told you they saw it happen? Well, maybe they did it in a secluded area, so we must have the murder weapon because Agent Johnson was elephant tranquilizer used. Members of the jury, we don't even know where the murder weapon is. We don't even know if that vial was used to kill Dawn Clark. Members of the jury, this is an animal sanctuary. They treat animals, they sedate animals, they use these tranquilizers every single day. And their conclusion that one was missing was that it was used to kill Dawn Clark. Members of the jury, that's not reasonable. And better yet, members of the jury, we don't even have a body in today's case. When I questioned Agent Johnson, she was confident when she said that this was a homicide. She was confident when she said that Dawn Clark was killed. Members of the jury, I want you to think about the evidence that you heard today. I want you to think whether or not we actually know he was killed. Because not a single person saw him. We don't have the murder weapon, and we don't even have the body. Well, members of the jury, let's assume he was killed. Let's assume that he's dead somewhere, and we just didn't find the body, the murder weapon, or have any eyewitnesses. Let's talk about someone else who wanted Dawn Clark dead. Members of the jury, you heard a name, Lisa Clark. We heard that Lisa Clark went to the elephant park. We heard that Lisa Clark looked Dawn Clark in the eyes and said, I'll wipe you off this earth. And you heard Agent Johnson say today that even 2 years later, Lisa Clark still doesn't have an alibi. That Lisa Clark was owed $2 million and she wasn't even interviewed. Members of the jury, that's not reasonable. This case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. Members of the jury, they're telling you that the kill was calculated, but members of the jury, you have to have proof of a kill. And they didn't even bring that to you today. For that reason, we're asking you to find Cara Bassett not guilty. Because this case comes down to one night that the government can only guess about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf. Ms. Goodchild, do you have a rebuttal?
Okay. Members of the jury, there's a reason that Mr. Clark's body was never recovered. No, it's not that he's alive somewhere. It's because it was a part of the defendant's plan. You see, you heard today that the defendant never called to report her husband as missing until a week after he left. A week for his body to disappear into that swamp. A week for it to settle. A week for him to disappear. Members of the jury, the reason we don't have that body here today is because the defendant's kill was calculated. Because if the defense's argument was true, that the defendant couldn't have done this, don't you think she would have acted a bit different? Wouldn't she have reported her husband as missing sooner? Wouldn't she have told us Soul that he was gone? But she didn't. Because it was all a part of her plan. Follow the evidence when you go back to deliberate and find the defendant guilty of murder.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Okay, so I'm going to ask all of the scoring judges to go ahead and complete their ballots. And advocates, you can just sit quietly until that's done.